What's going on, guys? It's your boy Jordan here. I'm back again for another video. This is part of my series where I'm talking about the camera basics. Now, I'm not a super knowledgeable, trained, technical individual, but I'm here to give you the basics. You know, this is what you need to know to operate your cameras. And the last episode I talked about aperture and how important aperture is, why it's used, what it means, some of the terminology you need to understand. But today we're going to be moving forward with that. You know, a lot of this has to correlate with lighting. And like you see, I have my lighting set up. I did a whole video on lighting. If you didn't check that out, go check it out. And then go back, watch the video on aperture, because I'm going to be building off some of the stuff we talked about before. When today, I'm going to be talking about shutter speed. And what is shutter speed? Well, basically, easiest way to describe it is the shutter that opens and closes, that's shutter speed. And what it means is how quickly does that shutter open and close. So basically it's just an amount of time. And that's usually referenced in 1 over something, in most cases 1 over 50, 1 over 250. And that's literally the amount of time that the shutter is going to be open to allow light take that picture of the moment you're trying to capture. Now, in photography that makes perfect sense, you know. When you're trying to take a picture of something, that shutter speed, how quickly that thing opens and closes. But the nuances of shutter speed as regards to video comes down to this thing called motion blur. Now, most people don't understand, but there's this rule. It's called the 180-degree shutter rule. It's a little bit complicated, but basically, depending on what your frame rate is, for me, I'm shooting at 24 frames per second. To shoot within the 180-degree shutter rule, you want your shutter to be double your frame rate. Again, you want your shutter speed, for me, right now it's 1 over 50, because my frame rate is 24 frames per second. Now, again, it's just about motion blur, and it's about natural motion blur. And the reason why we use that principle in videography is because if you were to make it to 1 over 200 or something, that shutter would be opening and closing really quickly, so there wouldn't be as much light getting into the actual device itself, but the motion blur would be all over the place. It would be like super unnatural and you'd be able to tell right away. So that's one thing to try and keep within your lighting principles. But as I mentioned, if you shoot at a shorter shutter speed and you make it like 1 over 300, 1 over 200, you're not going to be able to see anything. Like, you're not going to be able to see anything. You have to be in some of the brightest lighting scenarios. Like I mentioned, I'm at 1 over 50 right now. If I was to change it to 1 over 125, 1 over 200, you probably wouldn't even be able to see my face, because that's how quickly that shutter is capturing this image, that there's just not enough time for the light to get in. And you got to be in really, really, really bright scenarios, being outside in the sun, like super, super bright. And even still, you may have to tweak your settings even further to make sure you capture that image. Now, one thing in regards to photography that people don't understand, if you're trying to capture a photograph of something that's moving, shutter speed is extremely important to understand, because the quicker that object is moving, the faster your shutter speed has to be. If you have a very slow shutter speed, let's say 1 over 25, and I try to take a picture of you while you're walking, it's gonna come out super blurry. But if I was to take the same picture at 1 over 200, it would be tack sharp. It'd be perfect. And so that's where it kind of comes into understanding photography, videography. For videography, it's very simple. You follow the 180-degree shutter rule, where your frame rate, your whatever frames per second, is half of your shutter speed, or your shutter speed is double your frame rate. So again, I'm shooting 24 frames per second, then your shutter speed should be 1 over 50. If I'm shooting 60 frames per second, then my shutter should be 1 over 120, 125, depending on the camera. Not every camera has 1 over 120. Like, my camera doesn't have 1 over 48, so I shoot 1 over 50. You try and get as close as possible. That gets it done. But as I mentioned, the higher that shutter speed, the less light is actually getting into the camera. And so with photography, you need to understand that, and understand that if you want to take pictures of like athletes, people running around, pets, whatever, you have to have a very quick shutter, and that's going to make your pictures come out sharp. They're not going to be as blurry. And even for things like iPhones and stuff, they're not the best with moving objects, because they like to have a very wide aperture, which is good, but the shutter compensation is difficult when you talk about computational photography. It's good, but that's where having an actual camera really comes in handy. Being able to change your shutter speed, your aperture, you want to use those two things combined to really capture these images the best you can. And that's what separates what you do with an iPhone versus what you do with the camera. Being able to control this, you control the lighting, you control how it comes in, you control how quickly it takes that picture. All of this combined is how you really take good videos, good photos. And that's why I wanted to do this series. I want to be teaching you guys exactly what you're supposed to do. Now, when it comes to video, again, like I mentioned, you try and follow the 180-degree rule. If you're outside, you can run into issues, and you can buy accessories to help with that so you can follow that rule. But a lot of people break it. It's not as important as you think, but it has to do with motion blur, and it looks natural. You look at me and I'm waving my hand, it just looks natural. It gets a little bit blurry and doesn't look weird. It's hard to describe until you see me do something. If I was changing my shutter right now and I started waving my hand, you'd be like, whoa, that's crazy, that's weird. So that's where it's just a little bit different. But that being said, I want to just talk about shutter speed a little bit so you guys understand a little bit better. I know it wasn't the best explanation, not the most technical, but I hope you guys learned something. Definitely play around with it. Play around with your aperture. Look at actually how it impacts your shots, how it changes what you're doing, because that's really important. And the better you practice, the more you understand how shutter and aperture together really impact your images. Ultimately, you're going to become a lot better as a filmmaker, photographer, whatever you want to be. And that's why it's important to experiment with these things, understand what they mean. And that's why I'm trying to teach the main two concepts, which is aperture, shutter speed. And then the last one I'm going to follow in the next video is ISO, which is pretty straightforward, but I will go through it in the next video in a very brief, quick explanation. Thank you guys so much for watching. Make sure you like and subscribe to this video. Share it to friends if maybe they're trying to learn photography, videography. Hopefully they pick up on something, and please keep practicing because there's so much to learn. Even for me, I learn a lot every single day, but I hope this helped you. I hope this little tutorial helps you gain a better understanding of what shutter speed is and why it's used and how you look at it, how you even change on a camera and what it does to those images. So with that being said, thank you guys again so much for watching. I will see you guys in the next video on ISO. I'm out. Peace.